Let's move on from Europe now to the Middle East, talking about Iran, talking about the Houthis in the Red Sea, and so many of these other headlines as more talks between the United States and Iran are set to take place this weekend in Rome. This will be the fourth weekend of talks. Our colleague, Fox's Jared Halpern, with more details. Let's listen.
The U.S. and Iran held another round of direct talks over the weekend, with President Trump's special envoy, Steve Witkoff, leading the American delegation. Both sides say they are inching closer to a deal that would regulate and monitor Iran's nuclear program and avoid a military conflict.
Pretty sure it's going to happen. We'll have something without having to start dropping bombs all over the place.
This round of negotiations was much more serious than previous ones.
But the Iranians are accusing Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu of trying to tank the talks by insisting all nuclear enrichment stop, which Iran has called a non-starter. Netanyahu told President Trump over the weekend a bad deal is worse than no deal at all.
The real deal that works is a deal which removes Iran's capacity to enrich uranium for nuclear weapons.
And as the U.S. pushes ahead with diplomacy, it is also hitting Iran's proxy group in Yemen. But after 45 straight days of airstrikes on the Houthi rebels, the Pentagon still has not fully secured the airspace, with at least 7 American Reaper drones shot down since March. The Trump administration says regardless of the cost, they'll keep taking the fight to the Houthis.
The Houthis are feeling the pain. We have demonstrated any aggression against Americans will be met with decisive action.
The Pentagon says it hopes to move into the intelligence gathering phase of the Yemen operation within the next few weeks. At the White House, Jared Halpern, Fox News.
Jared, thanks so much. In the meantime here, let's bring into the conversation my friend at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, Behnam Ben Taleblu. He joins me. Behnam, good to see you here. I hope you had a great weekend. We do want to get into this story that broke over the weekend, and I want you to comment on what you're seeing. I'm going to read from some of the copy there from the Associated Press. Take a look at this. All right, so this is what's happening there. Iran finally extinguishing a fire at a southern port rocked by an explosion as the death toll in the blast rose to at least 70 people killed, according to authorities. Satellite images analyzed by the Associated Press showed the devastation of the explosion that injured more than 1,000 people. Now, the photos from Planet Labs PBC came as local news reports from the site raised more questions about the cause of the blast Saturday at the Shahid Rajai port near Bandar Abbas. Now, the Iranian Interior Minister announced the fire had been put out, while provincial emergency health officials gave the death toll, and it could potentially rise here. The port reportedly took in a chemical component needed for solid fuel for ballistic missiles, something denied by authorities, though they've not explained the source of the power that caused such destruction. You know, Behnam, what was at this port to cause such a large explosion here? Do we know? Have you spoken to any people who study the region, people in the region?
Great to be with you, Andrew. Even with the nuclear negotiations in the background on the same weekend, it seems like the Middle East always promises to never let anyone really genuinely have a weekend off here. But really, there was a humanitarian tragedy on a significant scale here, one that, based on the regime's own statements about this being an accident, but an accident linked to materials that were in containers, can only draw one's mind towards exactly what you mentioned at the tail end of your question there, which is the precursors for the solid rocket fuel, 2 ships worth that earlier this spring had docked into this port, a port and really a terminal where more than 50% of the country's commercial and oil trade does go in and out of. Would strike me as a gross oversight by this regime. No one knows if there's a sabotage element involved or how deep the accident versus carelessness thesis goes. But quite rightly, those in Iran are beginning to point a finger at blame, especially if you look at Persian language social media, at their own government. And then there's also comparisons being made to the behavior of Tehran's proxy in Beirut, Lebanese Hezbollah, who, if you remember back in 2020, A similar situation happened there, but not with percolate, this time with nitrate in 2020, and the major Beirut port explosion there, which took quite a significant amount of lives, unfortunately, there as well. So patron proxy acting very much the same, bringing in materials relevant to the production of long-range strike capabilities and fuels and oxidizers there. And then again, the people pay the price.
You know, Behnam, you don't see any, hallmarks or fingerprints from the Israelis here?
The Israelis have actually pushed away from the table on this. Sometimes when it is them, sometimes there will be relative silence from the Israelis. It still is too soon to tell, but when it's the Middle East and it's the Islamic Republic of Iran in particular, the Occam's razor approach is really the wiser approach here, which is the simplest explanation is the most likely. And an accident covered by, gross incompetence that actually let some of those materials there atrophy could be one very, very likely thesis. Again, we don't know the source behind the spark of some of these materials yet, but it is a gross oversight nonetheless.
Yeah, I'm a prime adherent to Occam's razor. Behnam, I have to ask about the talks now. The third round taking place this weekend. Are they bearing any fruit? What fruit are they supposed to bear? I guess that's the real question.
Fourth round will be back in Europe again. We've had one round in Oman, one round in Rome, one round back in Oman, which ended this Saturday after a little over 4 hours of allegedly direct or indirect talks, still moderated or mediated by the Omanis, who are playing a major diplomatic role here. And again, round 4 will be in Europe come this Saturday in early May. The Americans have actually been rather tight-lipped about all of this. And unfortunately, Iranian public diplomacy and information warfare even have really shaped the space. And all we have to compare and contrast on the American side is some of the statements about dismantlement and some of the backsliding about permitting low-level enrichment, particularly by Special Envoy Steve Witkoff. We now know there was a technical delegation sent for the first time, headed by Michael Anton. On the American side, a former Trump NSC official. On the Iranian side, a former JCPOA negotiator, Takhte Ravanchi, and also a deputy from the Iranian foreign minister, Gharib Abadi, were also present. So, round 3 marks a key difference because there's technical talks. But if there's technical talks so soon and no real framework offered, or at least publicly offered by Washington, that does generate real concern about a potential collapse in the U.S. position, particularly when it comes to dismantlement or disarmament, and does unfortunately put the president, if all else believed from the Iranian side is to be believed, in the position to be sliding in towards a flawed nuclear deal, much like he left back in 2018, which would be a strategic and political own goal.
Yeah, no, I have to ask that, because are you seeing any differences yet between the framework of this deal? I don't want to call it a deal yet because it hasn't been reached, but these talks to what the Trump administration 1.0 pulled out of, the JCPOA that was brokered by the Obama administration. Do you see any fractures or fault lines, any differences between the two yet?
The problem is, again, the U.S. has not offered its own interpretation of the talks, and even that which the Iranians are offering is technically not a particularly sophisticated readout of the talks. So as as talks do progress, deal defenders and diplomacy defenders are saying, well, the devil will be in the details, and therefore that's when the real problems will be made manifest. Whereas the sanctions defenders and the deal detractors will say, well, if the continued technical conversations go on, well, maybe that's where one side will make more concessions to the other, rather than those major gaps being sticking points. So pushing away from the table because the U.S. has not articulated a framework exactly for those negotiations yet. It's still a lot of guesswork. But I'll tell you 3 things that the Iranians do want from these talks that make their case for engagement fundamentally different than the case for engagement back in 2013 or 2015, when A, the Iranians were trying to generate a real deal for sanctions relief, and B, the Iranians were trying to come up with a theory of the case to present themselves as quote unquote responsible nuclear stakeholders. 2025 is drastically different given the high risk, high reward nature of their escalation, particularly nuclear escalation, their regional losses, U.S. economic leverage, and their issues at home. And reason number 1, the Iranians are talking, particularly talking to Trump, is because they believe the more they're talking with America, the less likely it is that the Israelis will be shooting. So reason number 1 for the engagement this go round is to avoid a direct or preemptive Israeli military attack. And if you believe the recent New York Times story about the president waving off strikes, well, then that checks that box. Second is maximum pressure. Trump is actually going after more bigger and China-linked entities as he restores oil and energy sanctions on Iran. But conversely, the more the U.S. continues to express an interest in talks and stays at the table, the more the Iranian rial is appreciating relative to the U.S. dollar, then depreciating even in the first 3 rounds of talks. And then, of course, if you're an illicit trader, illicit shipper, moving Iranian oil or energy from Iran to China, well, then if you believe a deal is coming, well, then you'll continue to engage in that illicit behavior rather than push away from the table. So there's some real concerns here that the Iranians are winning simply by showing up.
So lastly, I know you study this region of the world. I have to ask, we have some of this file footage there, as you can see, of U.S. strikes against Houthi targets. And I want to put this up. This is from Reuters. Idris Ali covers the Pentagon for Reuters. He has this, that corpses covered in dust and debris were scattered in the wreckage of a detention center for African migrants in Yemen after what Houthi-controlled television described today as a U.S. airstrike that killed 68 people. Behnam, we've been hitting Houthi targets in Yemen, for 3 months straight? Is that bearing any fruit? What are the Houthis' capabilities like right now? Do you see this going well into the spring and summer months here? I mean, some of these strikes on Houthi targets are taking place every day.
Yeah, there certainly is an increased pace of military operations from CENTCOM against Houthi targets. I would take Houthi reporting, particularly Houthi media reporting about the nature of their targets with more than a grain of salt, particularly because they're quite keen to, erode the U.S. political will to continue to carry out these strikes. But just because the Trump administration is exceeding the relatively low bar that the Biden administration set, which was wait till you get attacked and then respond, the Trump administration is now taking preemptive military action, but it hasn't really articulated a political strategy for that preemptive military action. And even if the targets do range from ammunition depots to weapons production facilities, to trafficking routes, to even going after allegedly key persons, really the brain trust behind the Houthi terror network, which there was some stuff sanctioned for today, by the way, by the U.S. Treasury Department. That really is more of a management rather than a solution type approach that the administration is bringing to the Yemen file, which means that we're going to see probably a lot more strikes and have a lot more questions until finally the Pentagon or CENTCOM provides a real battle damage assessment to the press and to the American public.
But Behnam, the Houthis are not Hezbollah. And I think a lot of people watching, we cover the Middle East each and every day here with folks like yourself. I would venture to say that many are asking, what's taking the U.S. Navy so long to get rid of the Houthis?
Well, let me push back on that by saying that in some ways the Houthis are more advanced than Hezbollah. Hezbollah was lethal by virtue of geography and proximity. There was that arsenal of 150,000 rockets, mortars, drones, ballistic missiles, and even anti-tank weapons. But that was like a sharp knife against the neck of the Israelis. And the Israelis showed through how with intelligence, they could marry military power and intelligence power to really gut the leadership structure that had their finger on that trigger. And now they're going after what's left of that arsenal, ceasefire or not. The Houthis are, again, the only proxy of Iran with medium-range ballistic missiles, the only proxy of Iran that have and have used anti-ship ballistic missiles. These guys might be the newest element of the axis of resistance. But in terms of their capabilities, 2015 to present, they are the most lethal. And when you remember that Yemen was a country cut in two during the Cold War, that previously this country was awash in Soviet and later Russian and Chinese and North Korean weaponry, and that there's a tribal dynamic to the fighting and a sectarian dynamic to the fighting here, well, the Houthis simply have taken a local conflict and regionalized it, if not globalized it.
All right, Behnam Ben Taleblu with the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Behnam, always good to see you, so insightful. We'll definitely be speaking soon. Have a good night.